community provider Q&As on issues such as eviction prevention, immigration, and restraining orders. The sessions were offered to provide some insights from local legal experts and highlighted questions that were coming directly from community providers working on the front lines. Hopefully, these virtual events help develop and reinforce important community collaborations between legal services and social services, because truly never have we needed each other more. Today's program is going to run about an hour and 15 minutes, and I want to start by just thanking Rochelle Hahn at the Mass Law Reform Institute for providing all of the foundation and building blocks for all of these Q&As over the last year. The hope of the commission is that in holding these forums, that we're hosting a dialogue. It's not a traditional training where the focus is on a few people just sharing what they know, but hopefully a space where each of us is open to learning from each other about our experiences and how to best help folks. The substance of today's discussion is rooted in the questions that were submitted ahead of time by all of you. So thank you very much for participating in this part of the dialogue. Based on the questions that came into us, today you can expect that we're going to touch on a few things. One, the proposed changes to immigration law and policy and process that's happening at the federal level. A little bit about accessing public benefits and its impact on the public charge analysis that has lots of people talking. We're going to do some updating about the existing laws as they relate to temporary protected status, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or Daca, asylum, deportation and removal priorities. We will talk a little bit about how COVID is still impacting the processing of immigration cases. And finally, we're going to wrap up with some tips on how you can get help with trying to find answers to immigration questions. Please feel free to add any questions that you have that come up during the presentation in the chat throughout the event. Emily Brunelle from the Justice Center of Southeastern Massachusetts is going to be keeping a close eye on the chat, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. But I ask that you remember a couple of things as we get started, that today's event is not an Immigration 101 type training, but there is a great training that's coming up that has a lot more depth to it. Next Thursday, actually, April 8th, from 9:30 to 4 is a program that's put on by the Mass Law Reform Institute in collaboration with the Mass Continuing Legal Education, that is going to really dive into specifics about immigrants, particularly in accessing benefits. So that's not what today is about. We also, unfortunately, cannot try to tackle specific questions on individual cases today. So if you still have questions that are lingering after today's presentation, we encourage you to please try to reach out to get an individual consultation with an immigration attorney to try to dig out from some of those questions. So my name is Jennifer Howard. I work at Rosie's Place. I probably should have said that a couple of minutes ago. Sorry about that. So I am the legal director there, and we run a series of clinics for guests, for any women who is poor or homeless who has some legal questions. Through the years, we have offered a weekly immigration clinic that has always been very, very busy. For many years, it's been basically, what's the word? It's been one of the most demanded services at Rosie's Place. Almost immediately after Joe Biden was sworn in as president this year, I received a call from a woman that I know had met with our immigration partners at Rion many times. She is a middle-aged woman who has been in the US without any kind of status for over 30 years. She used to work, she got injured on her job a few years ago, and she has really no way of supporting herself right now. So she comes to Rosie's Place for a lot of different things. In the days just after President Biden's inauguration, she called us again and wanted to know if she could meet with the immigration attorney again, because she wanted to know if there was any changes or if there were any new paths now that we had a new president that she might be able to take advantage of. And I'm guessing that maybe a lot of you on the Zoom call right now got similar calls from folks. Immigration has long been a complicated tapestry of shifting priorities and rules and processes. And many of us who work closely with immigrants are very aware of how important it is to try to keep up to date on the changes. And we also know how really, really hard it is to do that. So as I mentioned a little bit before, today's brief program is not going to leave you with everything you need to know about immigration, but it's intended to address the impact of two major events that have affected the immigration landscape today, both the pandemic and the change in presidential administrations. Both have brought some changes, but maybe not as many as you might think. And so we're hoping that through today's program, you'll be better equipped to help your clients find the legal help that they need when they have immigration questions. To do this, we have two great legal experts here with us today. Mario Paredes is a staff attorney at the Mass Law Reform Institute and coordinates the Joint Immigrant Detention Conditions Project, which is led by MLRI and the Prisoners Legal Services. It's focused on supporting immigrants who find themselves incarcerated as civil detainees in our county jail system. Before becoming an attorney, Mario spent several years working with various community-based organizations, schools, and nonprofits. He's a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Mass Bar Association, and the Boston Bar Association, and also sits on the board of a local immigrants' rights nonprofit, Centro Presente. The other attorney that we have with us today is Emily Leung, who you may, if you went to one of the prior Q&As that we did, also presented at that one. She is the supervising immigration attorney at the Justice Center of Southeast Massachusetts, where she's dedicated to serving immigrant populations and has extensive experience representing clients in citizenship, family-based petitions, asylum, U visas, VAWA, special immigrant juvenile status cases, and removal defense. In addition to direct representation, she does community outreach, education, and impact work through policy and legislative reform. So thank you both for coming today and answering our questions. So let's dig in with talking a little bit about the lay of the land. Specifically, we're sitting here on April 1st, 2021. What does it look like now compared to April 2020? Which I guess is kind of the smallest question for the biggest response possible. But Emily, could you start us off by just talking a little bit about kind of the immigration reform wish lists that are out there right now in terms of what President Biden has sent over as his kind of wish list, and also what the House of Representatives has passed recently?
Yes, thank you so much to Rochelle and Jen for helping to organize this event. And we're really happy to be here and excited to see so many participants, which is great. And I also appreciate Jen pointing out that this is a short amount of time to cover a lot of information. So unfortunately, we won't be able to get to everything. But in terms of just starting out, there's been a lot of reporting about things happening on the federal legislative level, including President Biden sending over a proposal for the Citizenship Act of 2021. And I don't know about the folks on this call, but I know our offices and others have been getting calls from folks asking about the new law. And unfortunately, we're going to start a little bit with some bad news and then move into the positive developments. So I'm going to kick us off with the bad news, but then we'll get into some positives right after that, which is, we're really just still in a proposal phase right now. We had two bills that recently passed the House. That's the Dream and Promise and the Essential Work or Farm Workers bills, which provide pathways to citizenship for TPS holders, dreamers, and also individuals who are in the farming industry. However, there's no schedule currently for when those bills will be taken up by the Senate. And also, given the rules of the Senate, it's not clear whether or not it will be successfully passed in the Senate. That being said, there's a lot of other moving parts within the Congress at this point. There's also the Citizenship Act bill, which I discussed, and hopefully will be taken up for discussion in the House in April. But again, really just in a proposal phase. It hasn't even passed the House. It hasn't had debate in the House yet. Another bill was introduced last week on essential workers. I also know that in both the COVID relief packages and also as part of the infrastructure bill, there's discussion around potentially inserting some immigration reforms in those. But I really think the takeaway is that while I think all of these proposals and the movement in the House are really positive, it's great signaling from the federal government that we want to do things on immigration. There's nothing actionable for us there at the moment. So there are no new laws for citizenship. And I would really want the message to get out that folks should not be paying attorneys to sign up for a new law. They should not be paying to get in a line or get ahead of other people. We don't yet know whether these bills will become laws. And so it's just a little bit early, but I'm really heartened by the sort of change in rhetoric that signals. And I think after the last few years, it is nice to at least know that some people in government are interested in doing something to help our immigrant communities. But really, I think the big takeaways are that, while we love to see it, we're just not yet at a place where there's something actionable there. And in our resources that are going to go out after this, we included a couple links to some reliable websites where people can go to get those legislative updates to see how things are progressing in Congress. But unfortunately, right now, there is not a new pathway to citizenship. We only have those as proposals.
Thanks, Emily. Emily B, were there any questions that were in the chat related to what the kind of proposed laws changes that we should address right now?
No new questions about that.
Great. Okay, let's move on. So, every one of us here on the Zoom call today knows how hard immigrants work to support themselves and their family. And we also are all very aware of how many barriers there are that stand in their way. So we're going to talk now a little bit about some of those rules and barriers. And Mario is going to walk us through one of the bigger changes that has happened that is positive and probably on everybody's mind, and that is related to public charge. So during the last presidential administration, we know that there was lots of changes to what was called the public charge rule, and it created tons of confusion about what kinds of assistance folks could reach out for. So Mario, would you mind just talking a little bit about briefly kind of what public charge is and how it's changed under President Biden?
Yeah, of course. And thank you again for everyone, the hosts and the participants, and all of you who are tuning in and submitted questions as well. A lot of the questions that we actually received were around the use of public benefits. I know even though there's been some positive changes, there's lots of questions still out there. But just to kind of start off, on March 9th of this year, the Trump era public charge rule that had been causing a lot of this confusion and fear that we've been talking about these past few years, it was permanently ended or invalidated. So basically, as a result of that, what happened now is that the long-standing policy that was in place before this Trump era public charge rule is back in effect. The policy, it's known as the 1999 Interim Field Guidance, and I'll kind of go into what's in that and where we stand with that right now. But I'll say this now and I'll say it at the end again. The overarching message here is that most immigrants who qualify for public benefits are safe to get them. And I think that's a message that we want to especially get out right now with the coronavirus situation and folks in a lot of tough positions. And so that's something that I'll try to clarify as we move forward. But before we jump into kind of details of the guidance, as Jennifer just said, what is public charge for those who are a little bit unfamiliar? So some immigrants applying for their green card or applying to be admitted into the U.S. are asked questions by immigration officials, and some of those related to their use of certain public benefits. So the purpose of these questions that are asked of them is to determine on the government side if an immigrant is likely to become what they say a public charge. And that basically means someone who's likely to become primarily dependent on the government for support. And if the government ends up determining that someone is a public charge or that they would become primarily dependent on the government for support, the government can decide to deny admission to the United States or deny their application for becoming a legal permanent resident or a green card holder. And in very, very, very limited circumstances, it could even lead into deportation. But I'll clarify again, this is not the main takeaway. So who does, the first thing that you kind of really have to think about in terms of, okay, is one of the families that's coming to me going to be affected by this? Is who does public charge even apply to in the first place? And there are some kind of more narrow categories and some exemptions. So basically it applies to folks who are applying for their legal permanent resident status, again, their green cards, lawful permanent residents who leave the United States for more than 180 days and try to re-enter, and then applicants, overseas visa applicants. So those are kind of like the broad categories. Now, keep in mind there, like I said, there are exemptions and a lot of folks who it doesn't apply to this whole public charge test. and I'll repeat this, but lawful permanent residents who are applying for their citizenship do not have to worry about this. You know, like I mentioned before, it's those who are applying for their legal permanent residence, not their citizenship. Also, lawful permanent residents applying to renew their green cards don't have to worry. You know, DACA, TPS applicants and renewals don't have to worry about that. And even for some folks who are applying for their lawful permanent residence, there's a lot of exemptions for certain humanitarian statuses. You know, a lot of the ones that a lot of you, I assume, work with folks who are refugees, asylees, you know, folks that have UNT visas, you know, special immigrant juveniles. So there's a lot of exemptions. So I'll kind of leave it there to not overcomplicate it. But again, who does the public charge rule apply to? It's a limited number of folks. Now, another thing to consider is, what do immigration officials even look at? You know, what are the public benefits they look at? What else are they looking at in making this determination? So they look at a variety of factors. Usually we talk about this and, you know, we talk about benefits, but the rule is broader than that. They look at someone's age, their health, you know, their financial status, and, you know, the submission of an affidavit of support from, you know, a family member. And the use of certain benefits is only one piece of evidence that they look into. So which are those two benefits that could potentially be, you know, used for public charge determination? One of those is public cash assistance for income maintenance. So that could be things like TANF, EAEDC, or SSI. So all kind of federal, state, or local cash assistance for income maintenance. And what I mean by that, and why I emphasize for income maintenance, is that other cash assistance benefits that, you know, that are not, you know, that are not recurring payments, like, for example, a lot of the cash assistance that's happening right now because of the pandemic, or other cash programs that are not need-based, like unemployment benefits, those are not considered under the public charge, you know, determination, the public charge test. So those do not need to be worried about. So the first one is public cash assistance for income maintenance, and the other is long-term institutional care at government expense. So an example of that is, you know, being placed in a nursing home at government expense. Again, this means that anything outside of these two benefits that I just mentioned, public cash assistance for income maintenance and long-term care, anything outside of that does not count for the public charge determination. Can everyone hear me? I see a message here saying that someone's having trouble. Okay, so anything outside of those two public benefits do not count towards the public charge determination. And also, like I said before, keep in mind that some immigrants don't even qualify for these benefits. And so I'm not going to get into that because that's part of the, you know, the MCLE that was mentioned. But again, I'll wrap up here by just saying the takeaway is immigrants should not be advised to go off, you know, essential public benefits without really doing a careful examination of the type of benefits, the timing, the amount of benefits they received, their status, and other factors as well. So, you know, if you really have strong doubts about somebody receiving benefits, it'd be good that they talk to, you know, an immigration attorney who works in this area with benefits use.
So Mario, just to be clear, so
Yeah.
somebody maybe is getting some housing assistance. Is that likely to fall into a bucket that could cause some trouble?
No, so, and I could maybe talk a little bit about that too, but no, like housing benefits, for example, SNAP benefits, other health benefits, those are not counted in the public charge determination. And so those are things that are safe to get if someone qualifies for them.
I see in the chat somebody else was asking about daycare vouchers. Is that something that would fall into that bucket?
Yeah, so daycare vouchers, likewise, it's not for income maintenance. So any sort of, and I think another one around, you know, mass health. So again, if it's not long-term institutional care, which is like nursing home, for example, and if it's not cash assistance for income maintenance, you do not need to worry about it for public charge purposes.
Okay. I want to move on and just briefly, I know that this is a huge topic in itself, but just to talk a little bit about what immigrants need to be able to work legally in the United States, and if you could just talk a little bit about employment authorization and when that comes into play.
Yeah, and maybe I'll kind of backtrack a little bit just to try to tie up some loose ends with the benefits, since I see still kind of questions coming in on that. I mean, if it's helpful, I could go a little bit more, but you know, there are certain like subsidized housing and things like that that certain folks with certain immigration statuses can benefit from. But again, those you do not need to worry about them for this purposes. So I don't know, Jennifer, would it be helpful to go into that a little bit more, or?
I'm sure it would be.
Okay,
Please.
so I'll kind of touch on first some of the housing stuff and some of the other TA, FTC, and cash benefits. So again, I'm not going to go into depth. This is not an area that I, work in, but there's other experts in this field, and they're going to be presenting at the MCLE that we mentioned. But just to give a broad stroke, folks, in terms of housing benefits, who qualifies and all of that. So there are several different kinds of public and subsidized housing and vouchers, and each has their own rule. I think generally state housing programs are technically open to all immigrants regardless of status. So that could be, one of the big ones right now that we hear a lot is RAFT, which is, a state homeless prevention program. So that's available regardless of, immigration status. But then major federal housing programs, they do have, a lot of immigration restrictions. And so these programs usually are restricted. So that means that assistance can only be provided to individuals who are either citizens or eligible non-citizens. So that tends to be, lawful permanent residents, asylees, trafficking victims. And so there are some federal programs that have no immigration restrictions, like low income housing tax credits. But, a lot of the major ones that we think about do. And then mixed families, which can include, families that have both folks who are undocumented and folks who have some sort of status. They can be eligible for restricted federal housing programs, but they will have to pay a higher rent, a prorated rent. And usually that means that that unit is no longer technically affordable. So a lot of people don't really, take advantage of that. And then in terms of shelters, I mean, there's the statewide like emergency assistance program, but they require at least one person in the house to have legal status. So if you're thinking about how to support undocumented immigrants who aren't able to apply to that, you would kind of have to contact shelter by shelter to see, about their availability and whether they have other restrictions. And then in terms of like TAFEC and cash benefits and SNAP, which is another big one I think that are on folks' minds right now, is that major cash assistance programs have immigrant eligibility restrictions. So, qualified and eligible, for TAFTC, SNAP, and SSI would be groups like, refugees and asylees, like I've mentioned, and others. Now, when we're thinking about nutrition benefits, SNAP does have immigrant eligibility restrictions, but when we think of other programs like WIC or lunch programs or pandemic EBT, which has been a big one, this past year, or even the use of food banks, pantries, and all that, they don't have immigrant eligibility restrictions. So they're safe to. So they're they don't have those restrictions for folks with no status. And I'll just wrap that piece out by saying that in the housing realm, like I said, no public charge consequences if you qualify for any of these housing programs, because it's not part of the public charge test. And then in terms of cash benefits for income maintenance, like I said, it could be used in weighing the public charge, in terms of weighing the public charge determination. But remember, it depends on the type of cash assistance and if the person is even affected by public charge in the first place. And like I said, that's a very limited group. So sorry, Jennifer, I just wanted to kind of like tie some of that up because I know there's tons of questions.
I'm sorry, Mario. Can I just ask you one more clarifying question? Because I think it's kind of rooted in a bunch of the questions that are coming in right now.
Please.
If you have a U.S. citizen, if you have a non-U.S. citizen parent who's collecting TAFDC on behalf of their U.S. citizen child, does that go against the non-citizen parent?
No, so it does not. It's for whoever the recipient is of the benefit. So
thank you.
Yep, no problem. And I know, and I think, sorry, I know I kind of backtracked, but your question was around like working, right? You wanted to
Yes,
kind of,
yeah, the authorization to work.
okay. So again, just a very broad stroke here is that typically only people with, lawful permanent residence or green cards, U.S. citizenship, and certain types of like work visas can accept employment in the U.S. without having to get a work permit or an employment authorization document first. And only a few categories of people actually qualify for a work permit. And so those tend to include folks who have filed, an application for adjustment of status to become a lawful permanent residence, folks who have been granted asylum, or folks who have a complete application for asylum or withholding of deportation submitted, TPS recipients, or a few others. We could actually probably include a full list, but you could look at I-765, which is the form that typically is submitted with this, to kind of see what some of those statuses are that typically need work authorization. Now, as of, just to touch briefly on a question that's come up a few times, is that as of this past summer, in order to apply to a work permit or an EAD with a pending asylum application, um, uh, you have to wait at least 365 days before being able to apply for that. That said, there is current litigation right now that has that if you're a member of the organizations that are part of that litigation, then the 365 doesn't apply to you. The 365 days doesn't apply to you, and it's a shorter time period. But it gets a little bit more complicated. So I think we're going to be submitting some resources so folks can kind of look into that, because I know there were questions about when can you apply for work authorization or not. And then the last thing I'll say on this is working in the U.S. without authorization, could put your green card application at risk. So it's important to remember that just because you have some sort of lawful status in the U.S. does not automatically mean that you have permission to work. And so, if you classify for permission to work, then you have to apply to EAD. And like I said, that's through the I-765 form and other evidence that you need to submit.
So before we move on, I just want to go back because it looks like there's still a couple more questions about whether Mass Health or receiving tax credits for health insurance, I think is what I read, if that could impact the public charge analysis. I just want to make sure that we all leave with an understanding about that.
Yeah, so those, I guess generally speaking, do not count. I didn't see the full list of the questions, but again, you just want to really be mindful here that if it's hard to come up with a complete list of things that don't count towards public charge, and that's why it's always good to just go back to what are the two things that do count, because anything outside of that is not going to affect folks. And I think also here, I will flag a comment that I saw here from Pat Baker at MLRI as well, which is important to keep in mind, which is that, one of the, I'll kind of just read it out here because I think it's helpful for folks to know that one of the confusing parts of things with SNAP and TAFDC is that the EBT card is issued in the name of the adult, even though the benefit might be for the children. So this is kind of going back to your point. So the DTA approval notice should state which household members are beneficiaries. So the adult household member does have proof of who got SNAP or TANF in that case. But again, it's just important to keep that in mind. You need to look out for who the benefit is for.
Great. Thank you very much. Can you speak briefly to the stimulus checks? Because I think we've gotten a couple of questions about that as well, as in who can get them, and if there's anything generally you want to say about that as they relate to immigrants.
Yeah, so I think briefly, so I know there's been now, as folks know, a few rounds of different stimulus checks. So in terms of thinking about this most recent round, from this past few weeks, basically the payment is $1,400 for individuals, $2,800 for married couples, and $1,400 for each dependent. So Unlike previous rounds of other stimulus payments, families will get a payment for all the dependents claimed on the tax returns. So that includes children over age of 17, college students, and also even adults with disabilities. In terms of immigrant eligibility, similar to the second round of payments back in December of last year, members of mixed immigration status families who have social security numbers and are otherwise eligible for the payments, they can receive a stimulus payment. Now, unlike the first and the second round of payments, children with social security numbers can get the payment this time around, even if both parents file their taxes with ITIN numbers. So this tends to happen a lot with folks who are undocumented and are filing with ITINs instead of social security numbers. So with this new round of payments, children with social security numbers can get the payment if even if their parents have ITINs. This will provide a lot more benefits to millions of children who in previous packages were not eligible. However, tax filers with ITINs are still not eligible to receive payments under the stimulus. And so, of course, that continues to leave out millions of folks, undocumented folks, essential workers. So they, if they're filing with ITINs, they're still not eligible. And taxpayers who did not receive the first or second round of stimulus payments last year or got less than the full amount that they were eligible to claim, you could still claim that on your 2020 tax returns. And I guess to wrap that up, how do you get this? How do you get this new round of stimulus payments? Is filing taxes for 2020 by May 17th, I believe is the date. If you have taxable income, I think you could file later if you have no taxable income, and otherwise, you could also claim it on your 2021 tax returns next year.
Thanks, Mario. Emily B., are there any questions in there left that you think we should circle back on?
I think we covered most of them. And the only thing is, if you have permission to work, wouldn't that mean you have a tax ID? That's one lingering question.
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Sorry, it says if you have permission to work, wouldn't that mean you have a tax ID?
So I think typically if you're getting when you, for example, apply for your work authorization, that you're supposed to also get like a social security, or you could get that within a few weeks. From what I last heard, I don't know, Emily, if you have any thoughts here. I know there was delays happening in terms of getting social security numbers this past year. So that's one thing. Otherwise, some folks who don't have social security numbers can apply to get their ITIN numbers and apply through that. Is that your understanding, Emily?
Yeah, I agree. If someone has work authorization, then they would be eligible to get a social security number. That's something that they have to mark on the application, that they want their information to be shared with Social Security in order for them to get the Social Security card. The pandemic has caused delays with the issuances of Social Security numbers and Social Security cards, because for some categories, people need to go for an in-person appointment and bring documentation to the Social Security office to actually get it issued. There are more appointments available now for people to try to get their Social Security numbers if they don't have them. But someone who is work authorized with a work permit is eligible to get a Social Security number, yes.
Okay, no, thank you for that. And yeah, I know there's a lot of questions in terms of this, and it's a pretty, can be a complicated or tricky area to figure out. And so, I definitely recommend, if there are kind of specific questions, reach out to some of the organizations. I know, for example, Greater Boston Legal Services has folks that are doing a lot of this type of work as well, and answering these questions and have information. And so we'll try to circle back, and if there's any additional resources we could include in the email we send out afterwards, we'll tie that in as well.
It does look like there's one more question that just came in. If parents are undocumented but children are citizens, in order to get stimulus, the parents would need to file for something called an individual tax identification number and file taxes on behalf of the family with their individual tax identification number, which is different than a social security number, but is available to individuals who are undocumented.
Is that the same thing as the ITIN that you guys were talking about?
Yes, it's the same as the ITIN.
Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Why don't we, I'm mindful of the time, and we had just over a half an hour or so left, and we've got lots more to plow through. So why don't we move on to the next section, and then if we have time, we can circle back and see if there's any more questions about this. I think that now we are going to turn to looking at a couple of specific types of statuses to get some updates about what's happening. And we are going to start with temporary protected status. And Emily is going to talk to us a little bit about what it is and how it has, or what's changed with it recently.
Sure. So we're switching gears, moving out of the public benefits world, and just talking about some different statuses that folks may have encountered with the communities that they work with. And so the first one we're going to talk about is temporary protected status. Temporary protected status is a type of temporary protection, as it implies, that the Department of Homeland Security can declare, and it's declared on a country basis, meaning DHS, Department of Homeland Security, makes a decision to declare temporary protected status for nationals from specific countries who were in the United States starting on a specific date. So for individuals who are here prior to that date, then they would be eligible for temporary protected status. So an example of that, it is primarily used for situations of humanitarian strife, be that natural disaster or civil war. So for example, most recently, Burma, Myanmar was declared a country that is eligible for temporary protected status because of the ongoing military coup and violence that's happening there. Sorry, Jen, I don't.
How many months has this been? One of these days. So can you give us an idea of what kinds of questions you're getting around TPS right now? Are there any myths or things that you want to dispel at this opportunity?
Yeah, I think that one thing that happened under the prior administration is that the administration attempted to de-designate several countries for temporary protected status. Those efforts have been blocked for now by courts. And so for some of those countries such as Haiti, Honduras, and Sudan, several other countries, they still have temporary protected status and they're still able to be work authorized, and those statuses are ongoing, but we're waiting to see which countries will be de-designated. We're waiting to see what's happening with the federal legislative proposals. So there are a lot of questions. I think a big one that I see that comes up a lot with the folks that we work with who have temporary protected status is that they often have work permits now that are actually expired. And that is very stressful, which I understand because they've been told over and over that they need that work authorization document in order to be authorized to work, in order to get their driver's license, all these kinds of things. But what has happened is that the government has extended their work authorization, but has not issued new documents. And this is creating a lot of problems for folks, both with employers and with the RMV. However, they are authorized to work, and I frequently write letters for individuals explaining and printing out things from immigration's own websites explaining that work authorization continues. I think the other thing for people to be aware of in terms of temporary protected status generally is that it's usually subject to a continuous renewal. So people do have to renew if a renewal period gets announced. And it's really important that they do so to maintain their temporary protected status.
Thank you. Emily, I don't see any TPS questions. Are you seeing any?
No TPS. Oh, one just came in. Could they apply for a new work authorization card?
So I don't know if immigration is I mean, they could try. If they were going to try to do that, I might suggest that they do a fee waiver with that and not pay the $500 to see, roughly $500 to see how immigration is going to deal with it. I'm not sure if they're going to process it because their position is that all of those work documents are currently valid, even though they are expired. So if someone wanted to apply for a new work authorization card, I would advise that they do it by using a fee waiver so that if it was denied, there wouldn't be sort of money spent by them that was kind of, I don't know that they have a policy explicitly about how they're processing those.
Well, that's because clarity would be terrible at this moment, right?
I'm happy to check on it, but I just, unfortunately, a lot of answers that we have are, we don't know what the government is doing.
makes you really sleep well at night. Let's move on to DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Is there anything new going on in that area that we should know about?
So yes and no. So since the Biden administration came into, I don't say power, that sounds aggressive, but since we have the Biden administration now, they have stated that they are very supportive of DACA. The prior administration tried to dismantle it. They made very clear that the DACA process had been reopened, which it was already reopened under the Trump administration, but that was because the courts forced them to reopen the process. And the Biden administration has made clear that they're processing those applications. And so for those who maybe still are not familiar with DACA, it's a special category. It's called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It primarily applies to individuals who, it only applies to individuals who entered the United States at a young age, have been in the United States continuously, and the eligibility requirements are specific to the dates in which DACA was enacted. And they need to demonstrate that they've been here and that they have either completed a educational program such as high school or college, or that they're in the process of that. There's also a second part of DACA that relates to military service as another way to fulfill the requirements of DACA. But not a lot of big changes in DACA other than, you know, for the last several months in the late part of the Trump administration, including they've been processing both new applications and renewals for individuals who have had DACA in the past. And I can report that those, in terms of the renewals, are going incredibly fast. Everything else in immigration is going, I don't know what's slower than a snail, but whatever the slowest thing on the planet is the current processing time for everything except for DACA renewals, which are going incredibly fast, like within weeks. So that's sort of, I see a question on the Texas case. There was briefing on, there are several lawsuits that are still kind of in various stages on DACA. Most recently, there was briefing that was due from both the defendants and the plaintiffs in the DACA challenge, and there has not been any new rulings or updates since that.
So is it, I don't know how complicated that case is, but is there 2 or 3 sentences that you could tell for the rest of us that don't know what that case might be about?
So several conservative states have filed to dismantle DACA and say that it was an overreach of the executive at that time, President Obama's authority. And so that case has kind of continued up and down and is ongoing. So we don't really know what's going to happen. In terms of the documentation issue, I would encourage you to, I just see a question that about this issue with the expired work permits. I know that there are some resources, it requires a lot of persistence with different agencies, but your client may be able to get a new mass ID, even though their work permit is expired if they have temporary protected status. And it takes a lot of work with the RMV. You essentially have to ask to talk to supervisors a lot of times and bring a lot of documentation, but they may be able to get their ID updated so that they can kind of go about the rest of their lives in which documentation is required.
Could you just confirm, I think that this is an easier question, TPS or DACA recipients, can they apply for SNAP?
I do not believe that they are eligible for SNAP, but if Pat Baker is still on this webinar, I invite her as the queen of SNAP information to chime in the chat.
It's like calling out to the universe.
Yes. Yes.
Call a friend. Okay, well, maybe Pat will pipe in if she's still on. And I don't know if this is a question that that you can answer, Emily or Mario, but it says, would you mind providing updates in terms of the previous administration's moratorium regarding bans on green cards and work visas?
Sure. So the moratorium in terms of processing immigrant visas for individuals who are coming from outside the United States and entering the United States. So just to clarify, there was no ban internally within the US in processing individuals who were here in the United States in getting their green cards, but there was a ban in processing individuals who were coming from outside of the United States on immigrant and non-immigrant visas, which would include for green cards. They have lifted the ban for immigrant visas, so individuals who are coming on green cards for permanent residency or other types of immigrant visas are able to come. They have unfortunately still not lifted the non-immigrant ban, even though some individuals are eligible for waivers to get around the non-immigrant ban and still come to the United States. I do think they made some updates, and Mario, you probably would know this better than me. I thought they made some changes with the student visas because those would be non-immigrant visas, and I thought they relaxed the visa requirements for those, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have probably up-to-date information on that, so I don't want to give the wrong information. I did want to circle back to quickly about the SNAP. I think it was mentioned, right? Whether SNAP, like, let me see what the question was here again.
I think if TPS or Daca holders are eligible for SNAP.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so, because I think they're considered Pru-Call. You know, it's this kind of like weird. Yeah, I'm not even going to get into that. But if you're really interested in that, you could definitely come to the MCLE training. But under that Pru-Call, it's not really a status. But if you're considered, under Pru-Call, fitting under that category, then no, there's no eligibility for food stamps or SNAP, and so yeah, that would apply to TPS holders.
Okay. Let's see. Let's move on. Emily, is there anything new related to asylum that you think we should put out there? Any kind of changes?
Oh. Yes and no. I would say maybe the biggest change in asylum processing actually relates to the winding down of the migrant protection protocols. That was also known as the Remain in Mexico program, and that was a program in which entrants from the southern border were forced to wait in Mexico in order to pursue their claims for asylum. And so the Biden administration is in the process of shutting that program down and bringing those individuals into the United States to allow them to seek asylum from within the United States, which was the process that existed for all the years prior to the rollout of this program. So that is sort of the main, most noteworthy change in terms of asylum processing. I know there's been a lot of reporting about the border. I would not necessarily characterize that reporting as entirely accurate. I know that there is an increase in the number of individuals who are coming into the United States, but many scholars in our field point to the general cyclical nature of migratory patterns, and that it's not really people making decisions about the safety and security for themselves and their families are not looking closely at what US policy is and who's in power to kind of make those difficult decisions. So in asylum, I think the wind down of the Remain in Mexico migrant protection protocols is kind of one of the bigger features of what's happening. Otherwise, as Mario had touched on, there's been a lot of litigation in the asylum sphere during the last few years. So it is difficult to know exactly what the eligibility categories are. Asylum has always been a relatively complicated area of immigration law, and unfortunately has become even more complicated over the last few years. But I would say that the MVP is probably the biggest change that has kind of happened in the recent months.
Thank you. Okay, Emily, you can take a break. We're going to move back to Mario for a bit to talk a little bit about enforcement and deportation removal priorities and what's kind of changed in those areas, Mario.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I know, obviously, going back to, the pandemic that's been affecting all of us. Because of that, one of the things that occurred was that a lot of interior enforcement and detention, in some ways, had decreased. This is due to various reasons, in terms of, uh, for example, litigation here locally that happened, for example, in some of the detention centers where folks were released because of their medical conditions and because of the overall risk of continuing to spread the virus. So um, even here in Massachusetts, the detention numbers are down. But that said, the detention system is still fully, operating and in place, and there is still upwards of 50,000, beds across the country where folks can be detained and are ready to be detained, you know, uh, depending on what the situation is with the pandemic. And so there's still a lot of work to be done there. Um, and there's a huge court backlog as well. So there's just a whole bunch of issues. So the question though right now is kind of like, who is ICE prioritizing in terms of doing enforcement, And so on President Biden's first day in office, he had issued an executive order and a memo that basically put in place a 100-day review period. During this 100-day review period, DHS is supposed to be reviewing and drafting kind of new guidance on all aspects of immigration enforcement. But one of the things that's been most kind of in the mainstream headlines has been in February, the Biden administration issued a new interim enforcement priority guidance for all ICE personnel on basically on who is priority for arresting, for detaining, for deportation, for release from detention, things like that. And so that's different than what happened under the Trump administration, because under the Trump administration, everyone was considered a priority. And so there weren't these kind of clearer guidelines as to where ICE was going to be placing its resources. And so now we do have guidance in place that in some ways is kind of similar to what was in place prior to the Trump administration, because under the Obama administration, there was also a set of guidances that were put out that also had a list of priorities. There's a little bit of a difference between those, and I won't go into depth of what those priorities are, other than to say the new guidance makes a few critical changes. One of those being focusing enforcement actions on a more limited group of individuals. Again, as opposed to the Trump era. And those three broad categories are national security risk, border risk, and public safety risk. There's tons of issues that I won't get into with that, because it's a little bit of a misnomer with labeling certain things public safety risk and who is considered a priority under this, but technically, in differentiating with the Trump era, there is some guidance. Also, another change it makes is requiring ICE officers to receive approval, to pursue enforcement actions against folks who fall outside of those three priorities. Also, there's some provisions around mandating a weekly reporting to the ICE director of all enforcement actions happening across the country. So basically, to summarize, I mean, issuing priorities is one thing, but meaningful application of these priorities has been a whole different issue. The administration has rolled out this kind of case review process, where individuals and attorneys can kind of use this process to identify cases they believe are no longer priorities and try to get their clients, out of detention, or so that they're not picked up by ICE. But again, there's been some success with that, but other areas where that's still been tough. So I think what this basically means is that this doesn't mean that immigration, detention, or deportation will stop, but there is some more opportunities to fight for the release of folks. At the same time, it means that there are in some ways, we're going back to policies that existed before the Trump era. And, those of us who have been working in this space or advocating for immigrants probably know that wasn't enough. There was still a lot of folks who were being pulled into the dragnet of immigration detention. And so it leaves really a lot of opportunities still to do a lot of more advocacy there.
There's an interesting question in the chat about whether or not if somebody is or is not vaccinated for COVID, would that put them in a public safety type threat?
So I mean, I think under this guidance that I'm talking about, I don't think if anything, there's potential for, yeah, kind of pointing to somebody's the risk they have of contracting the virus to kind of fight for them being released from detention. But under the guidance in terms of, national security or public safety, no. That said, I know there's some issues right now around, mostly around the border with these, maybe some of you have seen these Title 42 kind of expulsions of folks where the coronavirus has kind of been used as a way to weaponize kind of as a weaponizing mechanism for immigration enforcement. So in that sense, I think that's been happening. But in terms of these priorities and this guidance, as far as I'm aware, whether or not someone is vaccinated doesn't make them a public safety concern.
Thank you. Okay, I think that was it for some kind of the more political related updates, but I wanted to ask a couple questions about kind of what's happening in processing immigration cases with regard to like how COVID in particular is impacting it. And I know you both, there's a lot of areas that overlap with your practices, but I think it would be helpful for us to hear from both of you about kind of how you're seeing kind of the COVID impact on how just the cases are moving and where you are seeing the most snags.
I can start, and then Mara, if you have things to add, please jump in. In terms of immigration processing, I kind of already gave an update of my view on that a little earlier, which is everything is moving glacially, extremely slowly. Daca renewals is a weird small pocket of things that are going relatively quickly. In terms of immigration itself, they have been the courts and the immigration offices in terms of interviewing for benefits have been open for months. So even though a lot of other social services have been closed, immigration courts and the immigration offices have been open for in-person hearings and in-person interviews for some time. They do have updated procedures for COVID in terms of the volume of people that they're scheduling, allowing for advocates and interpreters to be available by phone instead of in person. But there are still a lot of instances in which individuals have to go physically in person. They are also allowing for quick rescheduling if there's any concerns about health or safety. So people should not feel like, if they're feeling sick, I need to just go to this appointment. They have a process in place to quickly get your appointment rescheduled if health or safety is a concern. Yes, the courts in terms of are all state by state in terms of the immigration courts. So in Boston, our immigration courts have been open for a while, but that's not true in every single state. But for most of us on this call, I think that we would be working with the Boston Immigration Court or the Boston, Lawrence, or Rhode Island immigration offices. And as far as I know, all of those are open and receiving individuals in person. That being said, if someone has specific health considerations in which they don't feel like they can safely attend an interview or a hearing in which they're being asked to come in person, they should raise those issues with the local office or the court in order to either postpone or to make other arrangements if that's possible. A lot of the court hearings can be conducted by either WebEx, which is a video platform, or by telephone, but that has to be requested. Interviews have to be conducted in person, but a postponement would be completely appropriate for someone who has health risks and cannot go in person.
Yeah, and I can't speak too much to what's happening on the ground in the courts because I'm not, unlike Emily and others, are not practicing in the courts on a daily basis. But what I have seen through conversations with other partners is not too far from what Emily already said. And the only thing I could really add is saying the scheduling right now has been something that a lot of folks has flagged as being completely disorganized and hearings being canceled last minute, where, you know, attorneys have been preparing for cases for their clients for some time, and then all of a sudden, you know, that doesn't happen, and there's not really been transparency from the courts on what's happening with that. So I think that's been a major issue, and something else recently that others have flagged too, especially advocates who, you know, previously were traveling with immigrant families to the courts, have been that, you know, they've had less access to support immigrants who may not have legal representation and need support from either family members or advocates, because unlike other court systems across the state where, you know, these web platforms have been open to either the public and others in the immigration space, these hearings have not been open to, you know, to the public and to, more specifically, to community organizations who in the past were helping folks, at least keeping eyes on what's on the process and what's happening in courts. And so, so that's been something that, because of the pandemic, has made it harder to even have, you know, any sort of transparency.
Thank you. Emily B., am I missing any questions that we should hit before we get into how to connect with help and resources?
No, I think we have one, but I think we can save it for the after that session.
Great. So Emily and Mario, this is our chance. We've got a lot of great advocates and people who are on the front lines. What are some tips or things that we can share to kind of help the people that they're trying to help? And where can people go to for answers to other more specific questions?
So maybe I'll just start off by just saying, in terms of, before jumping into kind of potential resources out there, again, I just want to highlight two themes, at least that came up out of the many we spoke about. But one of them, in terms of public benefits, is, again, just right now, there's been a lot of up and down with litigation these past few years, and this public charge issue has been kind of like on people's minds. And I think right now we're almost in this new chapter where we need to make sure folks are on the same page that, you know, overall benefits use is important, and folks should be seeking out the benefits they qualify for. Like I said, there's going to be some very limited exceptions to that. But again, if you have questions, rather than erring on the side of telling folks to jump off their benefits, I would say err on the side of saying, you know, it's safe to use your benefits. And if you have any questions, to confer with, you know, an attorney or a public benefits, you know, expert about this. So that's kind of one just overarching thing. And we're going to send some materials out with some organizations, including some immigration legal services organizations who have, you know, said that they're open to taking these sort of questions. I will say that, you know, for the most part, you know, immigration legal services organizations are answering questions about a lot of things right now. And so, you know, I would try to look at some of those resources that we send out and connect folks to organizations that are local to them. The other thing right now, the other thing I would flag is that, again, Emily mentioned this before, being careful about, you know, watching out for fraud and notarios when it comes to the use of attorneys right now and getting legal support, because that's one thing I've both personally and professionally witnessed, that because there's all these proposals out right now and all these changes that, you know, sometimes change on a day-to-day basis, that a lot of folks are taking advantage of. And so, you know, I know it's hard to know which attorneys to trust and which not to, and, you know, but I would say, if you have questions about that, you know, reach out to some of the, you know, organizations here on this call. And also, you know, always make sure that clients are talking to more than one attorney or one professional when asking questions, to make sure that they're getting, you know, appropriate advice. Otherwise, I think there's a bunch of different potential clinics and websites that could be helpful here. We're going to be sending some of those. I'll flag one here, and then I'll kind of see if anyone else has thoughts. But one of those, for example, is the Legal Resource Finder. So www.masslrf.org, and that's another potential resource for finding what are legal services out there available to folks who have questions. And Rochelle just posted it, so thank you, Rochelle. So that's one helpful place. Obviously, we have other trainings that are going on as well, like I said, the BBT training that's scheduled for next week. I think There might be some issues right now with the MCLE website. I haven't checked, you know, in the last hour or so, but we do have that scheduled for next week on April 8th. And so if that website comes back online, I would urge folks to register for that. If for some reason that gets rescheduled, we could also send out an email blast to let folks know as well. So I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure there's other resources, but Emily, you might have some other ideas.
I think all of those were great resources, and I would just add a plug in terms of like what this group can do. I agree totally with what Mario was saying in terms of, you know, accessing benefits that you're eligible for, and I would highlight specifically the vaccine. That immigrant families should be really encouraged to get the vaccine. Any person, no matter what their status, is eligible to get the vaccine and can get it for free in Massachusetts. And I know that there is quite a struggle right now in getting vaccines out to especially low income and immigrant communities. So I think that is an area where we could help encourage people. And we know that eligibility is opening up sort of statewide. And then otherwise, I think that, you know, this group is already doing the things that are helpful for the community, which is getting information, reaching out with questions, getting resources, and we will follow up with some additional resources that will help. And then I would just note, which again, on this call, you are the experts on this, not me, but we know that the communities that we work with are some of the hardest hit in the pandemic and sort of in this whole year, and what has been exposed in this country in terms of the differences in how people are living. And so, you know, helping connect people to resources, to mental health support and health support and all of those different things, I think are really important. And that's what a lot of you do. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Before I get just another kind of concluding thought from you guys, I want to just do a plug for the Rosie's Place Immigration Clinic. Unfortunately, it is only open to individuals who identify as women. But if you are working with somebody who does, who is a woman, you can send them to Rosie's Place and we can connect them with an attorney, an immigration attorney through our immigration clinic. All of our clinics are working remotely right now, so it doesn't even really matter where they are in the state. We can have our immigration partners at Rion give them a call to do a consultation, and you can get information about how to get to Rosie's Place from the website at Rosie's Place, and we can also include it on the email that we send out later. So we're just about out of time. Emily, are there any other questions that you think that we need to put some time into?
I'm not sure how much we addressed the health insurance on the public benefit, on the public charge issues. Individuals receiving tax credits for health insurance, and if any of that affects public charge rules, and if any public health insurance affects public charge rules.
Yeah, no, I mean, like health benefits and some of these like tax credits, those are not part of the public charge test, and so at least for those purposes, there's no concern about getting those.
And another one that I don't think we addressed, if a parent has a work permit, can they apply for citizenship through their child who is 21?
I can take that. It is going to depend on what that child's status is. So work authorization is, an individual needs to have immigration status to have work authorization, but their ability to apply for any other family members is going to be dependent on what that immigration status is. And I would just also kind of make a plug, if you are encountering folks who are saying, because I have encountered this a lot in my practice, like, well, I'm only interested in finding out how to get a social security number, or I only want to find out about work authorization. For non-citizens, those are inextricably linked. There is no work authorization without immigration status for someone who's a non-citizen. And so if the question that they're asking you is about how they can get work authorization, an immigration referral is appropriate, because they will need to be assessed to see if there's any eligibility for them that would connect back and allow them to get work authorization.
And I think that answers the other question that came in from Anna. Although if it's a pretty specific situation like that, you can reach out, but I think that answers that question as well.
Thank you. So circling back as we end, Emily kind of gave us the bad news at the beginning that all of the proposals weren't really law yet, so we shouldn't get our hopes up. But I'm just wondering, as we say goodbye, Emily and Mario, are there certain parts of the kind of proposed legislation and ideas that are out there that you're really excited about seeing get some traction?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that probably folks are more keeping their eyes on right now. I mean, there's a lot of details to these bills, right? But the fact of just having a pathway to citizenship, like I said, that's something that I think is, you know, one of the top priorities for folks. Of course, there's a lot more advocacy to be done there, because even there, it's a long pathway, and so. I think, you know, there's still room, all to say that there's still room to do advocacy, and we should all be doing that and making sure that whatever gets passed is, you know, something that is going to be beneficial and that it's not going to put more roadblocks up for folks in terms of adjusting their status. And then on the end of, you know, I do work in detention centers. And so one thing I'll also flag that I don't think we mentioned was that there's other bills out there beyond just these few that were mentioned, you know, one of those being the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act 2, which is to put kind of more eyes and transparency mechanisms and accountability mechanisms around ICE detention, because it's something that even here in Massachusetts exists. And you know, a lot of folks think of ICE detention in terms of the border, but we have it here in Massachusetts as well in our county jails. And so there's a lot of work to be done there too. And there's you know, a bunch of bills that try to get at some of that as well.
I would also echo, sorry, Jen.
I was just gonna say thanks.
I would also echo that while I led with the bad news that we're not there yet on any of these new bills, it is really positive to see that we are thinking about all these different pathways for individuals who are part of our communities to have the ability to be permanently part of our communities and have a pathway to citizenship. And I think some of the things that are not getting as much publicity are updates to things like asylum, are updates to things like U visas for victims of crime and expanding how many individuals can qualify for that in a year. Some things that relate to more discretion and waivers for people who have had some run-ins with the law to still be eligible to get status. So there's a lot of positive in there. I think, you know, I will speak for myself. There's a lot of positive in there, but I'm trying to be realistic about what we're going to get at the end of the day. But I think it's still great to kind of see those things being proposed, and some of them at least moving forward in these early steps.
I think with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks very much, Emily and Mario and Emily for helping to move this along today. And thank you to everybody that's on the call. It is really an important time for us all to be working together, and it is an honor to be on this journey with all of you. So thank you so much for the hard work that you do every single day. Thanks very much.